All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to STEM Fair. It is my pleasure to start off tonight's panels. It is incredible that we are able to host panels and attendees from all around the country. Over the course of this week, you will have an opportunity to hear panels discussing a wide range of STEM areas. It is amazing to see what science can do, from create a COVID vaccine in record time to the Perseverance rover on Mars. Before starting, I want to say thank you to the amazing team that helped organize this event. As I mentioned earlier, this entire week is full of panelists from many areas of science. Tonight, we will hear from our lightning talk speaker, Saray, followed by panelists from environmental science. Tomorrow is the computer science and robotics panel, followed by the engineering panel and college showcase panel on Friday. I want to encourage everyone to come to all of the panels. These panels cover a wide range of topics, and you never know what you might find. You can go to our website and join through the event links there. Recordings of all sessions will be available on our website at the end of this week. After each panel, including today, students are able to engage with panelists by asking them questions. You can ask questions to the panelists by using the Q&A feature. To access the Q&A feature, you should see a chat bubble button with a question mark. If you click this, you can type your question for the panelists. You can also use the Q&A if you have any questions about STEM Fair. All right, next we have our lightning talk speaker, Sarah. After she gives her talk, we will have the Q&A. Without further ado, please welcome Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just go ahead and share my screen, make sure everything's all good. Okay, I hope you can see that. Yeah, so my name is Sada E. Valdez, and today I'm going to be presenting on my undergraduate research project, earthquakes and megafloods. These are extreme events that are recorded in marine sediments off of the Pacific Northwest coast since the last ice age. All right, before we get started, I do want to just introduce what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll first be talking about just like the intro and talk about how earthquakes and megafloods occurred in the Pacific Northwest. Next, I'm going to be moving on to the methods and talk about how we are able to find these records of earthquakes and megafloods, and specifically what marine sediment cores and microfossils can tell us about the past. And then finally, I'm going to be going over my results and talk to you all about, did my core record earthquakes or megafloods? And without ado, let's just go ahead and get started. All right, so first I want to speak about megathrust earthquakes. And let me just go ahead and get this video started while I talk. So what are megathrust earthquakes? So specifically, megathrust earthquakes occur here in the Pacific Northwest, so Oregon and Washington and a little bit of Canada, because the Quantifuca plate is subducting underneath the North American plate. And as it subducts, it builds up a lot of tension, and eventually that tension subsides and a megathrust earthquake occurs. So these can be like level 9, level 8 earthquakes. And usually they're also followed by a tsunami, which is what you are seeing right here as I play again. And the last earthquake that we know of the size that occurred in the Pacific Northwest occurred on January 26, 1700. And you might be asking yourself, all right, so how do we know this date so precisely? So in the Pacific Northwest, Native Americans orally distributed the story of the tsunami and the great earthquake. However, they never documented it. But as you are seeing in this video, the effects of the tsunami were felt very, very far away, including over here in Japan. And at that time, Japan had coastal warehouses full of goods like rice that were insured. So we know from Japanese insurance claims on that damaged rice that this tsunami was triggered by an earthquake on January 26th. Also, based on modeling of the tsunami damage and local geologic evidence of a major earthquake dated to approximately 1700, we know that both of these were the same event, thus giving us the date that the last time this megathrust earthquake occurred was January 26, 1700. All right, that was a lot, but now moving on to what Missoula megafloods are. You might be familiar with these, you might not be. I grew up in Oregon and I never knew about them. So I'll just give a brief overview of what they are. So at the end of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, the Cordilleran ice sheet, which you can see here, hopefully by my mouse, extended down into Washington, Idaho, and Montana. If you know where your school is, I think it's around here. So 20,000 years ago, approximately, would have been completely covered by ice, which I think is really cool. But yeah, the lower limbs of the ice sheet created ice-dammed lakes where the ice served as a dam. And like modern man-made dams, this would hold water from going anywhere, creating a lake behind it. And these lakes were super huge, so they were about the size of a Great Lake. And when these ice dams failed, these giant lakes would drain out catastrophically. And we can look to this map and see that there were two glacial lakes that were really, really large. So there was Glacial Lake Columbia, which is around the Spokane area, or Spokane, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it actually. And also another even larger lake called Glacial Lake Missoula. And again, the ice dams from the Cordilleran ice sheet would occasionally fail, draining out all of these glacial lakes through most of eastern Washington, down into the Columbia River, and then finally out into the Pacific Ocean. On the right, I have a picture here of what eastern Washington might look like. And if any of you have ever been in eastern Washington, you might have noticed that while you're driving, there's just a lot of these like rolling hills. And you might have wondered like, oh, why are they there? That's like all I see. Actually, this is from like an airplane's point of view. And what this is showing are the ripples that occurred from these mega floods, which are really, really large. You can kind of see a road here, and you can now imagine what a car would look like, but these are giant ripples. Just it shows like how massive these glacial lakes were. So moving on to how do we find these extreme event records in the Pacific Ocean? I've already talked about how megathrust earthquakes kind of show in the ocean by like tsunamis and Missoula megafloods. They eventually drain out into the Pacific Ocean, and now I'm going to be talking about, how do we find these extreme events in the ocean? So one way that we can do it is through vibracoring. On the left here is a picture of the vibracore itself. It's essentially just like a long tube, and if you've ever had a straw inside of a cup, you put the straw in, you put your thumb over it, and then you lift up the straw and you have like water in there. That's basically the same technology we're using. It's just a pressure gradient difference. And then at the top here, this is just made out of lead, and once it hits the bottom of the ocean, we, as the name says, vibracore it. We just vibrate it really, really fast, and eventually it goes all the way down through the ocean floor. And then we put, our metaphorical thumb on top of it, bring it back up, and then out comes a little bit of sediment. Here's a much longer one, a much more successful one. This one was mainly full of water, but this one is completely full of sediment. And just to give you a scale of what that looks like, this is one of my friends. They are on the first level of a boat, and I'm on the second level of the boat, taking a picture of my friend who's trying to cap it from that second level. So they are very, very large, and some can get even larger. And yeah, here's just a picture of me right there, and then all of my friends who went on that specific research cruise. It was super fun. Another type of coring that we can do is called jumbo piston coring. So I'm going to go ahead and start this video now. And what happens with jumbo piston coring is that this first part, it goes into the ocean floor, and then once it's there, this, which is similar to the other one that I was talking about, was filled with lead, and it just starts free falling from here into the ocean floor, just penetrating the ocean floor, and then at the end we bring them both up. And the reason why I actually wanted this one to go first is because this one is free falling so fast that it would destroy any sediment sample that we get from this area. So we usually use this one to make up for it. All right, so specifically though, the core that I was working with, this is a picture from that cruise. I wasn't on it, but I was able to get one from my advisor at that time. And to give you all a little bit more context, here is where the Columbia River is. We were trying to gather those earthquake and Missoula flood records, and we knew that that they were related to the Columbia River. So we had two choices. We could either core at the bottom of the Astoria Canyon, which I think had already been done at that point, but there were signs that there possibly could have been some evidence of both of these at the bottom of the Willapa Canyon, which is just north of the Columbia River mouth. And this specific location where the red dot is and it's labeled O2JC, that's where my core was. Oh yeah, last picture. This is the picture of my core when it was initially sliced open. So again, we just penetrated the ocean floor, brought it back up, and then here it is split in half. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about the beginning the study of the core. So the first thing that we did when we came back was take CT images. They're basically like CAT scans that you would get done at a doctor, and they show different levels of density. The one that we used was through the vet school here at Oregon State. I think this is actually a picture from Oregon State where they put a horse in through, except our sample was much skinnier, and it was just a ocean core. But essentially, yeah, dark colors in these images show low density and more mud-like particles that develop naturally during normal times, and light is high density or more sand-like particles that occur because of tsunamis or earthquakes or megafloods. So the top part of the core, which the top is over here, and then as you go down and then follow back over here, these two connect, that's the core bottom. But the top part of the core is really dark, suggesting that there were no tsunamis or megafloods during this time. Below that, though, there are these really rhythmic bands implying a signal of tsunamis or megafloods. So our question was, which was it? What caused these bands to occur? There's specifically not really a great way of being able to know if megafloods caused these high density intervals, but we do know how many earthquakes occurred over the past 10,000 years. Therefore, if we can date the core and find where 10,000 years occurred, we can look for evidence of earthquakes and determine if this core recorded both earthquakes and megafloods or just megafloods. All right, so yeah, this is exactly what I just said. There are about 20 earthquakes that have happened within the past 10,000 years. For the sake of time, I'll just move past this, but that's the main point that I want to go at. So moving on, how do we find the start of 10,000 years ago? So to get this age model, we were going to be using stable oxygen isotopes ratios measured in foraminifera. Foraminifera are what I have pictured here. On the left are planktic foraminifera, which if you think of the word like planktic, it means that they live at the ocean, like closer to the ocean surface. And then benthic foraminifera, which live closer to the ocean floor. But foraminifera essentially are tiny protists that live as plankton in the surface of the ocean, as well as like scavengers on the seafloor. They build their calcite using oxygen and carbon atoms taken from the seawater they live in, and when they die and are buried in the sediment, those shells record the oxygen and carbon isotopic ratios of the seawater at the time that they were alive. And using that, we can essentially find what the levels of oxygen were in order to know when 10,000 years ago was. Okay, looks like I don't know what happened there. But these were the results that we got once we measured a few different depths of my core and got the stable oxygen isotope ratios back. So right here where we see an abrupt shift from about like 3.5 to 4.5, that is where we know that 10,000 years ago was. Even though we didn't directly date it, this abrupt shift anywhere within this area represents a shift from what we call the Pleistocene to the Holocene, or essentially from when it was like an ice age to a non-ice age time. And because of that, now we know where to look for earthquake records. So this next figure that I'm going to show you is very busy. Just bear with me. I'm going to talk through it a little bit and hopefully it makes more sense. I didn't have time to take out some of the busy things that aren't needed for this presentation. So I guess I'll go ahead and tell you what you can ignore. You can ignore most of like the orange, the blue, and the black line. which are just showing these different intervals of like high density areas that I talked about earlier. But what I do want to focus on is that just like the last slide, this red curve, I overlaid it onto this graph. So this is the same red curve. And as I said earlier, this is about where we see 10,000 years. So for this core, I wanted to see, okay, 10,000 years ago, we should be able to see evidence of about 20 or so earthquakes. And if we look in section A, that's everywhere where 10,000 years ago was, and you can't see any evidence of these rhythmic density changes in part A, which means that earthquakes most likely did not reach this site. So to wrap everything up, essentially this research showed clearer evidence that only Missoula flood events were recorded in this site, and specifically there's a potential for hand counting each mega flood event, which I know that papers have published that anywhere from like 4 of these mega flood events have occurred all the way to like 99 mega flood events have occurred, and mine is showing somewhere a little bit more in the middle at minimum. But yeah, that was my presentation, about like a year's worth of research in about 15 minutes. So I am open for questions, and I hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I think I stopped sharing now.
Okay, thank you so much, Saray, for that talk. I see that there are already many amazing questions in the Q&A feature right now, so we will begin the Q&A section of the event. So please keep in mind that we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Also, just to reiterate, to ask a question, you should see a chat bubble button with a question mark. If you click this, you can type your question for the panelists. Moderators will read your question to our speakers. All right, so Saray, our first question from a student, sorry, it's loading up, is if the core is lighter at the bottom because of the sun.
Is the core lighter at the bottom because of the sun? Yeah, so what the core was showing specifically in the CT scan that I was showing you is that the lighter colors were showing higher density. So it was more dense in those areas and it was a little bit less dense in the darker areas. So I guess to directly answer that question, no.
Good.
All right, sorry, my mic wasn't unmuting. Okay, so a question that someone else had is, since the layers in the core are of different widths, you would also know how long those even lasted, right?
Yeah, we could specifically date them if we had like enough resources. So what we would usually be able to do is if it was like, you know, like a section about 3 centimeters or so, we would try to take some of those foraminifera from one section and then another section of those 3 centimeters and then compare the dates, and hopefully we would be able to get a range of what that time was.
Okay, so we have another question for you in the chat. It's what do you do with the sediment?
What do we do with the sediment? That's a really good question. So once we take it from the ocean, we have this giant repository here at Oregon State. It's the Marine and Geology Repository. And essentially, if you've ever been in a factory, it's a really large scale like refrigerator, and it just has thousands of cores, and they're specifically set to be at the temperature of like oceans. So around, it's really, really cold in there. You have to wear a jacket, but that's where we keep them.
All right, so another question that we have is, could mega floods or ice caps happen around the world today?
Good question. So currently we have 2 ice caps on Earth. We have one on the North Pole, which is mainly in Greenland, and then we have one in the South Pole, which is Antarctica. And a big question as to what that scientists are really interested in learning is, will Greenland, the melting of Greenland, essentially occur quickly? Will it occur slowly? What's the time scale that will happen on? So by my research, hopefully within knowing how fast these mega floods occur, we can then determine or hypothesize how fast Greenland could melt in the future. Which sounds really catastrophic, but you know, it's good to know.
So we had another question. How does carbon dating work?
How does radiocarbon dating work? All right. Well, my PhD advisor would not be super excited with me right now. But essentially, the way that I understand how radiocarbon dating works is that in the atmosphere, there's carbon. There's always carbon. And when it interacts with sunlight rays, it turns that carbon into carbon-14. And carbon-14 has a half-life of about 50,000 years. So every 50,000, or sorry, not every 50,000 years. After 50,000 years, there's no longer going to be any of that carbon-14. And because foraminifera specifically within their shells, it's made out of carbon and oxygen, we can date the carbon inside of those foraminifera shells, and then that goes and tells us, you know, how old they are. The bad thing about this, though, is that because carbon-14 has a half-life of about 50,000 years, you can only go up to like 50,000 years in the past. Great question.
Another question in the chat is, I heard that the West Coast is due for a large earthquake. How true and likely is that?
Yes, the big one, as everyone says. So from my understanding, we can't predict when it's going to happen. But there have been these like clusters that the earthquakes happen in. So like 3 or 4 earthquakes will occur kind of back to back on a geologic timescale. And then there's going to be like a brief pause. And then again, there's like a few more that happen like in a cluster, and then there's another pause. And where we are right now, there have been a few that show that there may have been a cluster. However, we don't know if we're currently in a period where we could be due for one, or if it's more of that longer break. In general, though, you know, the Pacific Northwest is trying to handle infrastructure and a lot of other policy things to make sure that if it does occur, we're prepared.
Okay, so another question we have in the chat is, when was the last ice age and when is the next ice age going to be?
Good question. Yeah. So the last ice age was about 20,000 years ago. And the next ice age, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure when it's supposed to be. Based on, ice ages are usually based on orbital cycles. So depending on where the Earth is in relation to the sun and like the tilt and the way that it moves essentially controls when the ice ages are happening. And on average, they were happening at about like every 40,000 years. So if an ice age happened 20,000 years and, you know, now it's 20,000 years after that, we should expect one 20,000 years later. However, because of all of the carbon emissions that humans have put into the atmosphere, that's seeming to be very unlikely. So I actually don't know the answer to that.
Another question we had was, why did your research group choose this specific location?
Yeah, so from what I heard, this specific location was chosen not super on purpose. It was more of just like all right, let's go out here. We're recording a site that's a little bit close to this area, so we might as well just take the extra few miles, core at this site, and then come back. So it turned out to be, you know, like a really well chosen location, even though it wasn't super planned out at that time.
Another person asked if we can state whether an earthquake or a mega flood would occur in the future. So what do you think about that?
Definitely earthquakes will happen in the future, and if there's like another ice age, or when there's another ice age, I'm sure that there's also going to be more mega floods that occur because of that. So yes.
So another question we have in the chat is, does the hot place that you keep the sediment have radiation?
Good, yeah. So we keep the sediment cores in like a large refrigerator, and because of that, you know, like large refrigerator, there does have to be some radiation. I'm not quite sure how the specifics of that large refrigerator work, but we also have a freezer inside, like a large scale freezer inside of that building. So I'm sure the engineers who created it made sure that any of the radiation that was happening in that area are well constrained.
All right. I think we have one last question before we move on. So do you know how big the magnitude of an earthquake would be beforehand by looking at the clusters?
Yeah, so actually we have evidence that most of these earthquakes were around a magnitude 9 to magnitude 8. And if anyone remembers the like 2011 Japanese earthquake, that's essentially the size and the magnitude that it would be.
Thank you so much, Saray, and all of our moderators for that Q&A section. Next up, we will have our panelists for the environmental science panel. Each panelist will give an introduction of themselves and their research for about 5 minutes, and then followed by an open Q&A. Saray, you are welcome to stay for the panel. Our first panelist introduction is Argia Kanadaguli. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name. Please take it away.
Hi, can you see me? Yeah, okay. Hi, nice to meet everyone. My name is Argia Kanadaguli. You said it right, thank you. I am an undergraduate student. I'm in my 4th year at the University of Washington. I am pursuing my BA in Geography Data Science with minors in informatics and applied math. And a lot of my research has to do with environmental health disparity. I guess I could tell you guys about some of the most recent projects that I've had. Last fall, I was able to study disparities in asthma incidence in the state of California. And I guess you guys must be wondering, like, how do you use geography to study things like health disparity or the environment? A lot of times I hear from people that they think that geography is just, you know, about cities and states and capitals, and that's fine. I guess that's how a lot of us are introduced to geography, but you know, it's a lot more than that too. So you can really take any subject and understand the why of where. So in a sense, like why do people have asthma in a certain area more frequently than in another, or why are people with a certain like median income level centered in like certain areas versus others, like how are people located relative to different sources of pollution. There's all kinds of stuff you could really discover in that sense through geography. But back to my research project that I had mentioned. Yeah, it was super interesting. I was able to find a lot of publicly available data to study the subject, and essentially, I put together like some maps describing the locations of where people get more asthma, and was able to connect it with a lot of sources of industrial pollution in the San Jose Industrial Valley. And I don't know if I can share screen. Is that an option here? Yeah. Okay.
Should be an option.
Yeah. Okay. I'll pull it up in just a second. But yeah, essentially, it was a pretty interesting project that I was able to, I guess, follow in that sense. Sorry, it might take me a second. Long work day today, so I'm just now hopping on the call. But let me just take a quick second. In the meantime, I guess I could tell you guys a little bit more about different applications of geography in the environment, since that's what we're like looking at today. There's several aspects of geography have to do with like technology as well, such as GIS. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but geographic information systems. That's a lot of the times how we're able to utilize data, especially like environmental data about things like pollution and climate change, to visualize how those issues impact people in kind of different locations. And sorry, I'm still trying to pull this up. Okay, well, you know what, it's fine. But yeah, that's pretty much it about me. Currently I'm pursuing some more research also related to environmental health disparity, and if you guys are at all interested in that, let me know, and I'd be happy to speak with any of you about that. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Now we'll move on to Drew Gorman-Lewis for his introduction as well.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me all right. So I'm Drew Gorman-Lewis. I'm a professor at the University of Washington. I'm in the Earth and Space Science Department. And I would briefly describe my research as the interactions between water, rocks, and microbes. So I'm a geomicrobiologist. And I'm interested in questions like, how do microbes and minerals impact the movement of contaminants through the environment, impact the movement of naturally occurring chemicals through the environment. And I'm also interested in things like, how do microbes sort of impact their geochemical environment in terms of when they use energy, what's sort of the output or the waste products that they produce. And I'm really interested in extremophiles, so microbes that can live in really high temperatures, really low pH conditions. Sometimes those are really the most interesting microbes out there. So that's a very brief overview of the kind of research I do. And I wanted to sort of take the rest of my introduction time to tell you a bit about how I actually sort of got to where I am. And I'm going to start when I was a little kid, because I was always interested in how things worked. And I really liked to take things apart. Now, I was a kid, and, you know, I could manage to take things apart, but typically could not manage to put them back together, or at least in working order. So, you know, my parents recognized I had this curiosity, but didn't want me breaking everything. So they would take me to Goodwill and let me buy, you know, broken electronics and things so I could take them apart and see what was inside and see how they worked. But then no pressure to make it try and work, right? And as I got older, you know, I was very interested in chemistry in high school. That was probably one of my favorite classes. But I was also taking French and Spanish. And by the time I reached my undergraduate, I decided I would be a Romance language major because, you know, I had at that point taken AP French and Spanish, and I was already in upper division language classes. So, you know, that's what I did. And then I discovered that it was very hard for freshmen to get into upper division classes in college because they would all be filled up. And so I was like, well, I'll have to take sort of my gen ed requirements. And I remembered, right, I liked chemistry a lot. So I decided to take Gen Chem. And on the first day of chemistry class, the professor came in and she said that one of her goals was to get more underrepresented people into science. And, you know, I heard that and I felt like she was talking to me, right? At the moment she said that, I felt like she was talking to me. And that changed my perspective on the class entirely, because, you know, I was no longer hesitant to go to her office hours to ask her for help when I needed it. And I loved the class. And I did well in the class. And I did well in the class in part because I could go to her when I needed help. And I felt comfortable doing that. And she encouraged me to continue taking chemistry. And, you know, the next sort of step would be organic chemistry. And I ran into her just randomly and told her I was thinking about taking organic chemistry, but I was nervous about it. And, you know, she gave me a few tips and just encouraged me to keep going and said I could do it. And I'm glad she told me that because I continued on and I really liked organic chemistry. And then I discovered environmental chemistry and geochemistry. And that's where things really took off. And I talked to professors about graduate school and what I should do if I was interested in this. And, you know, they pushed me in the direction to look at sort of geomicrobiology. There were exciting things happening between geochemistry, the environment and microbes and all of those interactions. And so then I made some choices about graduate school based on that advice. And, you know, eventually got my PhD, did a postdoc, and ended up back in the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Oregon, at UW in the Earth and Space Science Department. So that's the quick version of how I got here.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Next, we will hear from Marcella Todd.
All right, you can see me, right? Yep, okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Marcella Todd. I am a senior at the University of Washington studying environmental science and resource management, wildlife conservation, and I'm minoring in quantitative science. I'm also an international student from Mexico. I was born and raised there, and I think that's a big part of my journey here at the University of Washington is trying to kind of find how that part of my identity fits into science and what I want to do with it in the future. A little bit about my time at the University of Washington and exploring what I want to do with my career and my major in general. I started off thinking that I wanted to do something environmental related, but I didn't know what that meant. And so I said, okay, environmental engineering, that seems like it's a fun choice. But then I soon realized that it's not actually what I wanted to do. And when I took environmental science courses and I saw how there was a lot of topics that I knew nothing about, I was like, this is what I want to learn. I want to do resource management and I want to do conservation. And then I picked wildlife conservation and I've been in it since then and it's been a great time. And some of the research projects that I've been involved with, I worked for a fire ecology crew the past summer. And what I did there was collect data on post-fire conifer regeneration in different parts of Washington. And that was really fun because I got to see kind of like the data collection part of science. And then now I'm working on my senior thesis. I'm looking at the relationship between egg size of a seabird and different marine conditions. So looking at like sea surface temperature and big oceanographic conditions like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and looking at whether those have an impact on the egg size of the seabirds. And I think it's a really cool project because it's the first time that I'm actually getting to use the data that I've been working with and analyze it by myself, and then also think about the management implications that this will have in the future. And so I feel like I'm just getting started with research, and I'm really excited to keep going. But I think from here, what I want to do after I graduate, since that's coming up pretty soon, is keep looking at research in terms of like human impacts on the environment and the ways in which humans can alter these, like can alter large scale ecosystems, but then not only focus on the big picture, like the large ecosystems, but also what that means for populations and individuals within wildlife. So that's a little bit about me. I'm ready to answer any questions you guys may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Our next panelist is going to be Polina Krichko. So sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And take it away.
Hi there. Can you hear and see me okay? Awesome. My name is Lena Krichko. I am currently an undergraduate at the University of Washington studying marine biology and quantitative science. And I actually have a little presentation prepared about kind of how I got to where I am, that whole process, like what really got me interested at first. So from Finding Nemo to Octopus Brains, the very first thing that got me into marine science is something that a lot of you guys are going to recognize, Finding Nemo. The otherworldedness of it all was like completely fascinating. I watched that movie on repeat. And I loved especially the deep sea, weirdly enough, considering I was a 3-year-old. And a little fun fact for you guys about Finding Nemo, there was a man, the lead scientist on the movie, who kind of helped out the artists to make sure that as much of the animation was as accurate as possible, actually works at the University of Washington at Friday Harbor Labs. His name is Dr. Adam Summers. So that was kind of the little crumb that started it. I'm lucky enough to come from the Pacific Northwest. I was born and raised here. I plan on working here for a while. And a huge part of living here is this fish. So salmon are an integral part of the culture here and curriculum. As a lot of you guys know, if you're from around here, you're introduced to these guys as early as the 3rd grade. I actually lived about 10 minutes away from this salmon hatchery. So we'd go there for field trips, and that was my favorite unit out of the entire year. I was so stoked. And every year I would ask all of these questions. I would like go to the gift shop and stare at these little beakers filled with salmon eggs because I understood nothing about it, but I wanted to know everything about it. Then in middle school, I attended Ocean Career Day at the Seattle Aquarium, where a lot of researchers and postdocs from the area came and talked about their research and talked about their work, where I ran into one Dr. Adam Summers. He talked a lot about his time on Finding Nemo and also his current research studying fish morphology, which is sort of like asking the question, why does this fish look the way it does? And what does that mean for its environment, or how it moves, or how it eats? And here's an example of something from his lab in the fish collection. This is a cleared and stained sculpin. And that event actually led me to volunteering at the Seattle Aquarium. On the left, you can see me as a youth ocean advocate, talking to guests, interpreting at exhibits. In the top left, I'm talking about harbor seal training. And at the bottom left, I'm actually talking about salmon life cycles. And so that was a really big part of my introduction to science communication. That is something that I'm super interested in even now. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to design a program for high school students about research. So we actually fundraised and got an ROV, or remote operated vehicle. You can see them in my hand in the top right corner here. And I designed this curriculum to essentially teach high school students about science, because a lot of the science you get in school is very textbook, and you don't get as many opportunities to get your hands on actual research and answer your own questions. speaking of answering questions, so my research at the University of Washington is like a tiny bit out of the scope of marine bio. I am actually in the psych department right now, studying octopuses. In simple terms, I study octopus brains and what that means for their movement. On the right side is actual data that I've collected. That's Steve. And I'm trying to answer the question of how does an octopus's brain and its neural system impact its locomotion strategies? Because they have a distributed nervous system, 3/5 of the neurons are found in their arms. And because they don't have bones or skeletons or anything limiting the configurations of their arms, they have essentially a completely independent system that takes in information from its environment in order to kind of make its next move. And in the bottom left here, I'm actually currently on San Juan Island at Friday Harbor Labs in the Zobot program, where essentially every day, every other day, we're out there doing field work, doing some sort of experiment. And at the end of the quarter, I'm going to have about a month to design my own research experiment. At the bottom left here, I think we were doing fucus counts. Fucus is like a seaweed, it's rockweed. And so we used a quadrat and we went out on the rocks and just counted as many fucuses as we could find on our transect. And that takes me to here. I'm actually working in a lab that is directly across from Adam Summers' lab. And I thought that was like a nice way to really tie it together. I actually took this like 2 days ago. That's what I have. Moving forward, I'm hoping to continue my octopus research, and my interests are actually in trophic interaction, so large picture ecology. So that's another thing I've experienced in, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Now we will move on to our next panelist, Julia Marks. Please take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. I also have a little slide, just one slide, but just so I don't forget anything. Let's see. Wait, sorry, one second. Okay, are you seeing it? Maybe, yes?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so my name is Julia Marks Peterson now. I'm from Bellevue. I actually grew up in the Bellevue School District. I went to Bellevue High, sorry. And I went to UW for undergrad, studied oceanography. I actually was also spent a quarter at Friday Harbor Labs, and I also volunteered at the Seattle Aquarium. Yeah, fell in love with oceanography. And when I was finished with undergrad, I just really loved teaching. I found myself kind of always gravitating towards tutoring and just really, really interested in just like sharing knowledge. And I also felt like I had spent like 5 years kind of tucked away in this bubble of climate scientists who, you know, we all just kind of knew the same stuff and we were always talking about the same stuff. And I kind of forgot what the public knew. And I wanted to kind of ground myself back in the public space. So I decided to go into teaching, where so I got a master's in teaching from Seattle University, and then actually was a student teacher with Lisa Neshiba at Sammamish High School. And I guess that was a while ago, so I don't know many students anymore. But and then I was a 6th through 12th grade science teacher for a few years in the Seattle area, and I loved it. It was amazing, and teaching is still kind of at the core of everything I love. But I really miss research, and so I started as a PhD student just this year in an ice core lab at Oregon State. So Sada is actually my classmate and colleague. So what I do is, so these pictures down here in the bottom are, so this is an ice core here. And these cores are really similar to the ones that Sada showed that are made of sediment, but these ones are made of ice. And they come from the polar region, so where we see these really stable, huge ice sheets like Antarctica and Greenland. And we can core them just like Sada was talking about. And they also show these kind of annual layers of precipitation. And as snow falls and it turns into ice, that ice actually traps air. And that air is basically tiny bubbles that represent ancient atmosphere. And so the reason ice cores are just so cool and unique is that you can extract that air and you can measure certain things that can tell you about what the past climate looked like. And so specifically what I measure is carbon dioxide. So I can go back and take slices of ice and measure the amount of carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere at the time that ice was formed. So you can see these layers of ice really are. There's actually just a lot of bubbles in the air kind of trapped within the cores. And then this is just a picture of the lab. So it looks, when I first saw this, when I first walked into this lab, I was like, I don't recognize any of these things. I am very overwhelmed. But this is a big extraction system. So basically the ice goes in here, you shake it really, really vigorously, and basically you're trying to extract the air without melting the ice, because when you melt the ice, you kind of screw up your signal. And then it travels through this column and through all of these different various traps that kind of pull out different parts of the sample that you don't want, until you end up with a pure CO2 sample that then you can go take to a gas chromatograph or a mass spectrometer and measure certain things about the CO2. So anyways, that was a lot, and I'm probably out of time, but I'm happy to keep talking about ice core research, but also teaching or anything that comes up.
All right, thank you so much. And for our final introduction, we're going to introduce Soraya again. Now, if you were here for the lightning talks, you might have already heard her story, but this is for everyone else who has joined during our panelist section, so please take it away, Soraya.
Unmute. Okay, great. Oh no, okay. Here we go. Yeah, so I wanted to give you all a perspective on like my story as a scientist from a non-science perspective, just like how I got into science essentially. So this is my story as like an underrepresented, low-income, first-generation Latina scientist. So who am I? I was born and raised in Salem, Oregon, and I'm the proud daughter of 2 Mexican immigrants. I learned English when I was 5, and when I was 12, I was a migrant worker, and essentially what that means is that I had to go into the fields to like pick blueberries and like other fruits and vegetables in order to support my family at that time. And at that point, that was like the turning point where I was like, okay, I don't want to do manual labor my whole life. I was only 12, but I knew that I didn't want to do that my whole life. So I was like, okay, I need to go to college. I didn't quite know what, but I always knew that I liked math and science. So I just rolled with that. Here's a slide of me in high school, just to make myself a little bit more relatable. So starting with my freshman year, like I said, I knew that I wanted to go to college, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I tried to get A's as much as possible. My sophomore year, I realized that I wasn't super interested in English or history, so I took summer classes in English and history just so I wouldn't have to take them my senior year. Here's me in band. I've always loved band. You'll see a couple of pictures of me in marching band in college later. But once I was a junior, I started taking math and physics specifically a little bit more seriously, and I realized, all right, I want to do something with my career related to math and science, but I still wasn't sure what. And I just want to show this as an example that not everyone knows what they want to do at a super young age, and that was definitely me. When I was a senior, I took only classes that I enjoyed because I, at that point, no longer was taking English or history. I was taking science classes, I was taking music theory classes, a lot of choir, a lot of just like, a lot of things that I enjoyed. So I got to explore a lot during that time, and I also joined what was called Willamette Academy at that time, which is essentially AVID, if you are all familiar with that. They helped me get into college, and at that point, again, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I realized, okay, I like attention and I like science, so I'm going to try to be the weather woman. And here's me thinking about being the weather woman. Unfortunately, because I was a low-income student, the only schools that I could go to were in-state. So Oregon State was also the only school that offered anything close to being the weather woman, which was a climate science degree. And I went ahead and just pursued that. The next thing I want to talk about that I feel like most people don't talk about is just like feeling like a failure in college, or even maybe sometimes even being a failure. So what happened my freshman year when I first got there was I was usually the only brown person in many of my STEM classes. I was also the first person in my family to go to college. I was the oldest daughter, and I always felt just like super lost, and I never knew what was going on. During my first term while I was at Oregon State, I also had a lot of racist encounters on campus, and just like all of these three things kind of boiled into one, and I stopped going to classes, and I failed my first class ever, which was calculus, and I got my first F ever. And I remember at that time just like calling my mom and thinking like, I don't want to go to college anymore. I feel really dumb. I don't feel like this is made for me. And essentially she was like, you know, you have to stay in college just a little bit longer, just like try it out a little bit longer. Like we've worked so hard, like please just stay in there. So I did. And then my second year of college, actually, that's when I started taking my first geology class. It was required for my climate science degree. And in my first geology class, that's when I learned that geology was more than just rocks. And I figured out that through geology, I could actually figure out what past climates were like. I also at that time looked for an on-campus support system, which was the College Assistant Migrant Program. And essentially they just help students like me who used to work in the fields, were like very, very poor. And they helped me through tutoring, book stipends, and mentorships. At this time, again, I was a low-income student, so I had to do 4 jobs at once. However, it wasn't all bad. I was also in the marching band, so here's like me and my best friend from marching band. And I started joining a lot of climate-oriented clubs. So I actually did get to fulfill my weatherwoman dream for one day where we visited a station in Eugene. And then after that, I did climate research, and you all just saw, or many of you just saw the presentation that I gave on my climate research. But after that, I did an internship. I think there I am. And then I just started going on a bunch of like different paleoclimate cruises and going on different boats. So here's a small boat that I was on looking for signs of actually that earthquake. And then here's me on a slightly bigger boat and an even bigger boat. This is on the East Coast. But eventually all my research led me to present at a national conference last year and turned that into a senior thesis. And it's funny because I feel like I actually fell in love with science really, really late in the game. Like it was essentially my junior year of college when I started to get super into science, and that's when I realized like this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. So now I'm a PhD student at Oregon State, and I just got news a couple weeks ago that I received the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. So I'm now fully funded graduate students for the next 3 years. And my research is specifically now about the causes of ice ages, and more so along the lines of like, does ocean warming trigger the rapid melting of an ice age? The next steps for my research include requesting ocean sediment core samples, prepping the samples at Oregon State, and then going to Rutgers on the East Coast to get measurements. But that ends up with like, okay, future steps. Do I want to stay in academia? For now, yes. I think that it is very important for me as a Latina to hold space in the geosciences. I also want to support the new generation of STEM people of color. And then lastly, I'm definitely eager to learn more about like Earth's climate history in order to figure out questions about like future climate change using the past. Yeah, I was probably also way over my time, but if you have questions for me, there is my email. And that's all. Okay, I don't know how to stop sharing. There we go.
All right. Thank you everyone for those introductions. We will now transition into the Q&A portion. We received questions when you registered, and so we will ask those first, but please continue to ask questions in the Q&A function. We will try to get to as many as possible. We will end this section around 6 o'clock. We might go a little over since it's 5:32. So our first question for our panelists, and this is to all panelists, is what is the most surprising thing you learned while studying environmental science? Feel free to jump in at any time.
I'll jump in. So a lot of my research is focused on contaminants, specifically like heavy metals, and I think probably the most surprising thing I learned is that some microbes will actually eat uranium, use uranium for energy. You know, coming from more of a geology and chemistry background, you know, I didn't really have any concept of what microbes were doing. And so once I learned a bit about microbial metabolism, and then obviously I was interested in sort of the geochemistry of uranium and learning about all these interactions that can occur like that, that was mind blowing for me. So yeah, I think that's it.
I can also hop in. Mine's a little more general. I had no idea going in, like, because I already knew I wanted to do marine bio. I had no idea how many like focuses there were. I came in being like, you know what? I like fish. Let's see what happens. But there's morphology, there's taxonomy, there's ecology, like anything that you are interested in, there's probably an entire group just focused on it. And I think that's incredible because it's like all of these circles with little overlaps. So you can talk to people who are like kind of are on the same page, but each bring a completely new perspective to the table. And I think that's really, really cool.
I can jump in next. So I guess I had an early introduction to the environment. My mom is an environmental engineer, so I kind of grew up hearing about a lot of like policy and things like that that go on, especially in Washington State. But then coming into college, I started seeing how it kind of like Polina mentioned, how it involves like a lot of different fields. And when I first started in college, I didn't actually know what geography was. So I guess my biggest surprise was understanding how much that the field of geography, how valuable it can be to research in about the environment, about public health and things like that, and sort of slowly starting to understand how I could use it to better understand the environment. So that was maybe the biggest surprise for me.
All right, if no other panelist has anything to add to that question, our next question is for Julia, and it says, how does one get involved in ice coring in university?
Oh gosh, it's a good question because I partially don't even know how I got here. Just kidding. Let's see. I think the beauty that like Polina and like I guess a lot of people have now talked about, but just the beauty of environmental science is that kind of interdisciplinary piece. And so something I love about this field is that people come into it with such different backgrounds. And everyone, I actually think labs, and this might be a unique thing to climate science, I don't totally know, but it feels like it's actually valued, like diverse experiences are valued because it actually provides like all these different perspectives when looking at the same set of data, for example. So I came into it because the first time I learned about an ice core, my jaw dropped. I was like, that's the coolest thing I've literally ever seen or heard of. But I wouldn't say that I had any like specific experience that made me qualified to be part of this lab. I just like was in earth science specific, like just generally. I actually was more in like geology and modern sedimentary processes in college. So this is a long-winded way of saying I don't think there is like a specific thing that you need to do to be able to be like qualified to be in an ice core lab. I think you just need to be like interested in earth and climate science, and then ask if people have you know, openings in their lab. And yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so we have another question in the chat. This question is for any of the panelists. They can answer. So the question is, what was the time when you guys got stuck in a situation, and what did you guys do to get out of the situation?
I feel like we can take this in many different directions, so I don't know if I'm interpreting it correctly, but something I think I struggled with was like saying yes to a lot of stuff. Like I just kind of kept saying yes and putting so many things on my plate, and like most of them I wasn't personally passionate about. And so this isn't really saying I got out of that. It took like years to get out of that. It wasn't like an incident where I was like, okay. But I think over time I have just gotten better at listening to myself and knowing the like volume that I can actually put on my plate, and yeah, not saying yes because I think someone like wants me to, like doing it because I actually want to.
Kind of completely different from that. One situation that I was in was last summer when I was doing field work. It was some like kind of harsh conditions just because it was long days out in the field hiking and collecting data. And when you're doing 2 months of this, it can get very tiring towards the end. And I found it more and more difficult towards like the last couple of weeks to like get myself to like actually do the work that I was supposed to do and with a good attitude. And so I was struggling a lot in that sense. And what I had to do was just kind of like reevaluate why I was there, why I got into it in the first place, and how I am capable of doing what I was doing, and I was there for a reason, and just kind of like having that conversation with myself and keeping my values in check, and that kind of helped me keep pushing to the end of the season, and it worked.
Similarly, I guess another thing that I struggled with, taking up space was really hard, like feeling like I was allowed to, because even though I had been interested in science for a really long time, when I thought of a scientist, I didn't see myself, right? So a lot of that like imposter syndrome, or like constantly being talked over and just kind of being like, all right, well, I guess I am not really allowed to talk, or that I shouldn't, and like not coming to office hours just because like I felt like I didn't have a place. I think that is a huge part of going to such a big university, is like that first lecture you go into and there's 250 other people all doing kind of the same thing you are. You're like, oh, okay. So it's like this fear of kind of blending in, especially being around like a lot of male STEM students. It's really important to like assert yourself. It's something I'm still working on. But I really struggled feeling like included in the community until I found my own community within that. And it's made it a lot better. I feel like excited to go into class all the time, but those gen eds are kind of the hardest part to get through because you're just kind of like in a wave of people all trying to get through it. So like, don't be afraid to take up space. You're allowed to be there. You're supposed to be there.
So if all the panelists would no longer like to add to the previous question, our next question was, are you hopeful for our future environment?
I can say something about that. I feel like I guess in a sense you kind of have to be, right? Like in order to, you know, see a future, you have to believe in one, which sounds kind of obvious. But I definitely believe that with all of the new technologies and things that we're figuring out how to use in order to work on things like environmental science and things like that, I definitely feel like we're a lot better equipped to deal with some of the environmental issues than we were years ago, like a couple decades ago. So that's been really exciting to see all those new developments. For example, like environmental data science, like that's a new up and coming field. And I'm just seeing all these developments in kind of every segment of environmental science that like all of us have talked about so far. And so I feel like we and like the next generation of like you guys, you students, like as you come, if you come into the field, like I feel like all of your perspectives and stuff will really help us create a better future.
Yeah, bouncing off of that, like, do I think there are going to be catastrophic results because of climate change? Yes. Do I think that we're going to be able to adapt as humans? Definitely. So I think, you know, we can definitely count on like the engineers that we currently have, or the architects, the policy makers, and, you know, even the climate scientists on all collaborating together and just working our way through this and finding out what our new normal is going to be. But I think we're all going to be okay.
I would say that I am hopeful just because I see the enthusiasm and care that the people around me and just in the field in general have. And I know that it's just going to get better and people are going to keep asking more complex questions and trying to find answers to them. And so that's encouraging because, I don't know, it's hopeful. And when everything seems really daunting, it's just nice to see that people are still enthusiastic, and that helps you become enthusiastic too.
Another question in the chat was for Drew Gorman Lewis. It was asking, how did you get interested in chemistry and how did it relate to taking things apart and seeing how they function?
Well, I think the relation is I wanted to understand things. I wanted to understand how things worked, whether it was something mechanical, something electronic, or even something chemical. So part of the story that I didn't tell you was that I would go in the kitchen and pretend to be a chemist by taking various food items and mixing them together, right? And of course, the ultimate is the baking soda and vinegar, right? I loved doing that as a kid. And I realized in high school that what I was really interested in was the chemistry of, you know, all of these different things and how they interacted. And I really liked my chemistry teacher too. It was just, for some reason, it was just something that made sense in my mind. And then sort of the leap from chemistry to environment actually came, you know, I was doing chemistry as, you know, for my undergrad, and I ended up doing undergraduate research in an organic chemistry lab. And, you know, it was, I liked what I was doing, but it was a little, it wasn't to me very connected to reality. Like I was synthesizing some molecules that had maybe some future purpose that was pretty murky to me. And then when I was looking for electives to take, I saw environmental geochemistry, and I was like, well, I'll take that. That sounds all right. And suddenly everything made sense. Like this was the chemistry of what was happening outside, right? It was the chemistry of what was happening in the river that, you know, flows through the town. And so suddenly I could put together sort of my love for sort of understanding these chemical reactions, but about something that I cared about, and something that's tangible, right? So hopefully that sort of answers the question about how taking things apart can relate to chemistry and can relate to environment.
Thank you very much for that. All right, so our next question is for anyone who wishes to answer. And the question is, do most environmental science related jobs have opportunities for a lot of field research, or is there more time in a lab analyzing a computer?
I think depending on what you want to do, you can choose your path in that. So for example, like I went on a couple of different cruises, and if I really wanted to pursue just being like a full-time field researcher, like on a boat all the time, I could have done that. But personally, I really like being a homebody and just analyzing data, being on my computer with my hunchback, you know, with just the glow of the computer on me. But I really enjoy that. I love the data analyzing aspect of it. So that's the science that I more focus on, but I would love to hear from anyone here that perhaps has more of a field work experience in that.
Yeah, I guess I can go. I think it depends on, well, and I mean, I wouldn't say I have a profession yet so I don't know anything other than institutions. But the two that I've been to are both have pretty massive colleges of basically the environment. And when that happens, there does seem to be just ample amounts of opportunities to do research. Both Oregon State and University of Washington have, you know, they have their own ships. They have, they both have marine institutions that are farther away from, you know, where their main campus is. Yeah, I guess where Polina is right now. And there's just so much that you can get involved in. I would say it is specifically like those two are these like R1 institutions that are very focused on environmental science. So I can't say that that's probably very true for other parts of the country or other institutions, but definitely in my experience, if you go to one of those two institutions, you're going to get a lot of ship time.
If no other panelist has any other comments to weigh in on, we have another question in the chat. This was originally for Polina, but I'm sure any panelist can answer it. It is, how do you get involved in labs and research opportunities?
So I'm a little bit of an anomaly here. I actually got into my lab by accident. I don't really know how else to phrase it, but the Seattle Aquarium does a lot of like after hours lightning talk events. From what I understand, you guys had like a lightning talk thing right before this, where, you know, panelists and researchers from the area come and talk, and afterwards they table and you can talk to them about their research for, you know, longer than 5 minutes. And I was actually talking to someone else, like some other panelist, and I said, how does someone at my, like in my academic journey so far, because I was a senior in high school, get into this? And my now mentor was standing there and she goes, where are you at in your academic journey? And I said, I'm a senior in high school. And we exchanged information. I ended up doing a lab shadow, and they were like, do you want to volunteer with us? I said, yeah, of course. I get to work with octopuses. Yeah. And so after volunteering with them for a year, I actually got funded for a fellowship, and that's kind of where I started my research. But in general, talk to professors, because a lot of professors, at least in the University of Washington, they all do research. They'll talk about their research. Like go on the website of the College of the Environment. Everyone has a list. Like every professor will list what their lab is, what they're doing. And honestly, just shoot emails. These people love talking about what they're doing. And the worst thing that'll happen is they'll say no. And it's builds your confidence to ask a bunch of people, like even if it's just like, hey, can I check out what you're doing? Do you have an opening? Because if you want to go into master's in grad school, that's kind of what you're going to end up doing anyway. So find what you're interested in, find who's doing it, and send them several emails.
I think along those lines, it's also don't be afraid to apply to things, even if you think that you might not get them, because you never know. They might list out like 10 different qualifications and you might only have half of them, but hey, that's what like someone who applied had and got it, and you didn't apply. So it's just kind of getting over that mentality that you might not get it, because there will be a lot of jobs that you will not get, or a lot of opportunities that you won't get, but the few that you get are going to be worth all the ones that you didn't get.
If we have time, this question goes out to anyone, but what was your favorite expedition / on-site place you've been to, and why?
I personally really liked when I was on a boat in the Atlantic, just because I was surrounded by miles of water, and you know, everything that I could see around me was water. And I know that's a little bit scary for some people, but I thought it was so cool. And because of the sea creatures are like super interested in what this big boat is doing in the middle of the ocean, there would be like sharks and like whales that would just kind of like swim next to the boat. And it's just so peaceful being out there.
I think my favorite thing was in undergrad. I was in a lab that studied sediment processes through river transport, and so they were studying rivers all over the world, and I was specifically focused on the Elwha River that was up in the Olympic Peninsula. But then I got to go to the Amazon with them, and that was the coolest thing, like maybe that's ever happened to me. If you've ever seen the kind of like research vessels that are on the Amazon, they look like skeletons of boats. There are no like walls because there's no need on the equator. So it's just this like incredible looking ship, and then you sleep in hammocks. So we had to like buy hammocks, and then you like hang them, and everyone, like, you know, there's like 40 people all like, you know, sardines just stacked together. And when the boat would sway, we would all just like move together like little, I don't even know. It was very funny. But that was probably the coolest thing that I got to do.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. I don't have like something specific, but what I really like doing when I go out on field trips, field work trips, I really like just sitting under trees and looking at the canopy, or like laying on the ground and looking at the canopy, and that's always like the highlight. And I make it like my mission to do that every single time I go out, and just take some time to like breathe and be thankful that I'm not in the city for a bit, and I just always enjoy that.
That is so much more peaceful than what I was going to say. Last week, we actually went to False Bay, which is an area on the island that drains entirely every low tide. And so my professor handed me a shovel, and she's like, go dig up some worms. And I went, absolutely. And so I was just in my rain gear with a shovel, digging up worms, digging through sand. And it was like the most I've ever felt like a scientist. Like, I just love getting my hands dirty, just like digging through mud. Everything smelled like sulfur. It was awesome. So that sounds much more peaceful than what I was doing, but different tastes.
Okay, so if none of the other panelists want to contribute to the discussion, we have another question in the chat. This is for any of the panelists can answer. Will taking environmental science help with a job that has to do with animals?
I mean, yeah, it'll definitely help because it's directly related, but you don't necessarily have to go, like, you don't have to start there to work with animals. You can, I just feel like it goes back to that thing that environmental science work is so interdisciplinary that you can start anywhere and always end up if that's what you want to do. So but I mean, it's helpful and it's interesting, so I would recommend.
Well, if no one else wishes to contribute to that question, another question we have for any panelist is, what is the process of getting your PhD like?
I mean, so Drew, maybe you should say, I mean, yeah, Todd and I are in our first year. We can say it, but you're probably like, oh.
Yeah, well, so I would say the process, it started during my undergraduate when I realized that going to graduate school was something I wanted to do. Fortunately, one of my various organic chemistry professors took time out of class one day to explain that undergraduates could do research, and there were research opportunities in the chemistry department and departments all over. That was news to me. And then number two, that for students in sciences, you got paid to go to graduate school. So you don't pay tuition, the school pays you. So that was another big thing that I did not know. And so having that understanding, I realized, okay, well, maybe graduate school could work for me. Like, why not, right? So then I had to figure out what I wanted to do. And I did that through, of course, taking classes. I did undergraduate research in the chemistry department. I also did undergraduate research in the geology department and found my passion. And then I talked to my professor about graduate school. And, you know, he gave me his advice about what the sort of exciting directions were happening in research, suggested places to apply to. I was also fortunate that sort of through my undergraduate research experience, I was connected with the McNair program, which is, you know, focused on getting underrepresented people their PhDs and beyond into academia. So I was connected with that program, which really helped prepare me for graduate school. And that was really, really helpful. So by the time I got to graduate school, I actually felt like I knew what I was doing. I had done undergraduate research in a couple of different places. I picked a really good advisor for me. That advising style worked. The program was, I went to University of Notre Dame for graduate school, and the program was fairly straightforward. And, you know, I just sort of kept my head down. I'm from Eugene, Oregon, so moving out to Indiana was South Bend, Indiana was culture shock, to put it mildly. And I really didn't like being there, but I was there for a purpose, and I knew it was a finite amount of time. And so all I was focused on was really finishing. And so I was able to finish fairly quickly for, you know, an average PhD. I was out of there. I finished my PhD in like 3.5 years. So, and right, if you're someplace you really don't want to be, that's kind of a motivating factor. So I finished quickly. But the key things were, you know, an undergraduate realizing, okay, graduate school is for me. That's what I want to do. Getting experience doing undergraduate research and getting connected to programs that help prepare you for graduate school, and using the people around me, using my professors to help, you know, guide me to sort of the right place. So, you know, some of that might be a little bit of luck, but you know, these are all things that you all can use to help sort of guide you on that path.
Yeah, and then I think maybe like on a, like from like a ground level right now perspective as well, like different programs do different things. Some programs require that you get a master's before you get your PhD. Some just want you to go straight into your PhD. And mostly they're about a couple years of classes where after you've taken those classes, and this is not always true, but in the program that I'm in right now in SADA, we are taking a couple years of classes. And then after that, you kind of go through this preliminary level of examination, of like exams, to where then they there's like a threshold that happens where then you become a PhD candidate. And then once you're a PhD candidate, you're kind of done taking classes and you are focused on your research. And, you know, that can last 4 more years after those 2 years. For Drew, it might have lasted maybe another year and a half, it sounds like. But so that's kind of the general process in like practical terms.
Yeah, I think it's good to point out that a lot of schools have sort of their programs vary, right? They vary in sort of the amount of classes people have to take, sort of the timeline that happens. The average amount of time it takes somebody to complete a PhD can be all over the map. But yeah, generally, you know, you take some classes, there's some tests, big ones maybe, right? You do research, hopefully you get a lot of publications, and you're done and you move on. Yeah.
All right, so we have one more question in the chat, and this is the final question of the Q&A. So for Argua and then any panelist, how much is data and understanding data becoming important in science?
I would say very, very important. There's a lot of people out there that say like data is like the new oil, in the sense that it is so valuable to everything. And the whole field of data science, data analyzing, it's like there's just so much data, and data itself doesn't really, in a sense, doesn't necessarily mean anything. You have to analyze it, you have to work with it to really derive meaning from it. So in that sense, I think I heard someone say it's like trying to get a glass of water from a fire hose. So it's like, yeah, I would definitely say data is very important to it. And I know I said earlier, like I had like a picture of my research, but I pulled it up, and this might give you an idea of what you can do with data. I'll just super quickly share my screen. There we go. Yeah, do you guys see that?
Yeah.
So this is essentially, this is what I was able to do with data that was freely available online. I was able to trace like kind of where asthma exists in the state of Washington and measure that up with where the most family poverty exists. And you can see like there's similar areas, which kind of clues you into other things, like where do you want to look for pollution that's occurring that might be causing or triggering asthma attacks, or what other things exist in those areas that are causing the pollution. So ultimately we were able to kind of understand how industrial pollution sites are kind of related to the incidence of where people are getting asthma. And it was interesting to see how that kind of measured up with all kinds of other socioeconomic factors like wealth and race and things like that. But it's a complex thing that like all kinds of environmental sciences, every kind of research is pretty complex. So data is, yeah, massive part of it. Sorry, I went on for a while about that.
Similarly, one thing we talk about a lot in ecology classes is like, you are the one who's collecting the data, so you're the one who understands it, right? I've worked with an Excel sheet that was about 3,000 rows. That means nothing to someone, but you are the one who understands it. So you're sort of the mouthpiece for the environment, right? Like if you're studying Puget Sound fishes, for example, you're the one, like they obviously can't tell people what's going on. You're looking at that data, you're analyzing it, and you're coming to a conclusion and then telling the people, right? It can go to policy, it can go to just like information. I think data analysis is the #1 component to SciComm nowadays. And as we're like entering this age of like freely available information and people that are searching for that information, having it available and already analyzed will lead to, I think, better understanding of our environment, specifically with these sorts of sciences, understanding of our environment. And I think it'll really help in sort of like this motion to better our environment now. So yes, I think it's super important.
All right. Okay, so that concludes our Q&A section and also our STEM fair today. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to all our panelists, our moderators, and everyone else who helped make this happen. To our attendees, you are encouraged to consider coming to our other panels for the rest of the week. You can join from the links on our website and find all the information on our website as well. There's also in the chat an after event survey. Please fill this out as we value your feedback. Thank you to everyone, and this concludes our STEM fair.